Hello, Mike. The one thing you haven't talked about yet is doesn't prayer involve listening as well and hearing, not just talking? Particularly the first type of prayer that you were talking about, the loud, open talking. That doesn't involve a lot of hearing or listening.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so I can't think of a study, that doesn't mean there isn't one, where they've done brain imaging or behavioral modification studies in relation to listening style prayer. So when I talk about prayer, since I'm not qualified to speak theologically, I try to give the most faithful representation of the work of actual scientists that I possibly can. I think most of my prayer life personally involves silence and contemplation. I don't know if you would call contemplative prayer listening as much as you would call it presence. I do know that some people in their prayer life, having some insight about what God might say to them is a major component of their prayer. And in the types of prayer I offered, I think the easiest way to get there is the Lectio. So it lets you, in the very structure of it, kind of personalize the experience to involve a degree of receiving not just being or state, but information, the action God could be inviting you toward. But I don't have like any neuroscience that puts a bow on listening style prayer. But fantastic question.
Don't be shy now. Hands up.
In Texas, they'll knock each other over for the mic. You guys are too polite.
You dichotomized the studies that talk about praying to a loving God, praying to an angry God. Wouldn't praying to a loving God, wouldn't you think that would make you angry at the places in life and in the world where love is not present? So particularly like Burma, Somalia, stuff that's been going on recently.
Yeah, I would think that, but the studies don't back it up. People who consistently pray to a loving God cause a characteristic change in activity in their thalamus. So neuroscientists don't know exactly why or what that means. A couple of neuroscientists surmise, based on other studies where similar effects are seen, that when you cause the activity in your thalamus to move toward one hemisphere or the other, as opposed to being really even across the two, some idea has become core to your identity. And when you pray frequently toward a loving God, the idea that they believe becomes core to your identity is that God is loving, oddly enough. Now, what's strange about that belief is it actually makes your faith and your emotional state more durable in traumatic environments, because you're able to surmise that all the present circumstances, miserable though they may be, are temporary and not as eternal or durable as God's love. You'll find that people of faith in less wealthy nations or less stable nations tend to report higher levels of personal happiness and tend to report feeling that God is closer. It's almost as if in the human experience, we almost need comfort to find ourselves feeling distance from God and to critique divine action so effectively. And which is rather counterintuitive, but does show up pretty consistent in the research.
So I was also a chubby red-headed kid. But,
Cheers.
Yeah, absolutely. But I didn't choose the trees. I chose the playground and kind of fought it out. But I think about, like, when you're talking, what about a developing brain, like a child's brain? I have 3 kids, and thinking about how, if they were to practice these things now, when they're young, would there be more sort of neurological development for creating better pathways or better connections? And then everything you hear about sort of technology and not looking at the light or the LED screens or whatever, you know, there's all these debates that parents are having. Do you think that kind of relationship to prayer, sort of intentionally, as you're talking about in these sort of different examples, would in a developing brain, starting that earlier, would that have a greater brain sort of development over longevity, or is there not really studies of longevity? It's just sort of looking at it now.
Yeah, so brain imaging studies are relatively new and very expensive. So one criticism of brain imaging studies is that the sample sizes are small. Of course they are. There's relatively few of these very expensive machines, and so you couldn't feasibly brain scan 10,000 subjects seeking a particular brain state. In the same way, long-term decadal studies are difficult because the imaging technology itself isn't stable enough, because our fMRI and our SPECT scanners and all these technologies keep increasing their granularity. They tend to produce results that aren't necessarily directly comparable. I suppose you could get interesting findings by like freezing a technology picture and then keeping an old fMRI on campus just for one study, but getting a grant for that's going to be tough. When we look instead at outcome-based studies, where instead of imaging the brain, we look at quantitative and qualitative metrics associated with learning and mood and prone or propensity towards anxiety and towards depression, starting meditation and prayer practice earlier in life is better. Scientifically speaking, the great inhuman trauma we're placing on our children is devices in their pocket. More and more studies are showing consistently more screen time creates less happiness, less screen time creates more happiness, more screen time creates more depression, more suicidal ideation, more anxiety, less screen time does the opposite. And meditation is a particularly potent form of non-screen time. So as a parent, I think it's important that my kids have devices, but I kind of police how often that they're allowed to be used. And under work circumstances, they basically get unlocked. And I also kind of put my foot on their backside and kick them out the front door and tell them to go play with people without their devices, because that's important for health. And I've helped both my children explore contemplative prayer practices. They don't both do it with equal ease. And that's why we talk about different forms of prayer. My youngest likes to say the same prayer with me every single day right before bed, and that's kind of where it goes. My oldest rather enjoys sitting together in quiet contemplation. So earlier is better, but I don't think we should become militaristic or dogmatic with meditation for our children. We should let them ease into it at their comfort level, and it can be a good counterweight towards the negative effects of screen time. Great question.
So I guess it's kind of like a personal question, but like if all the different kinds of prayer work, why are you drawn to Christianity over anything else?
Yeah, totally personal reasons. Studies have shown that when Buddhists meditate, they get the same benefits. When atheists meditate secularly, they get almost all the same benefits of spiritual prayer. But when I was 8, Jesus was there for me. When I first heard that in the United States, students had gone into Columbine High School and pulled out guns and shot other students and teachers, and everyone had this shock, and they thought, how could this happen? I thought, how could this have taken so long? Because anybody who's been bullied enough knows that the self-doubt and self-hatred and the fear eventually turns into anger. And I knew that in my life, even when I got skinny in high school and had friends and started dating and things were outwardly good, I still had this profound core of anger and sadness, and that there wasn't a week that went by where I didn't imagine walking onto my high school campus with a gun to walk up to that one kid who bullied me in elementary school to execute myself in front of him so that he would know what he had done to me. And the reason I never did that was because I knew that Jesus loved me. Regardless of any like fact claim or elegant apologetic or theology, my journey with Jesus has been deeply personal. And every time I take the Eucharist in Christian fellowship, I do this in remembrance not of an abstract first century figure, but a name that literally kept me alive.
Orla, there was a question down here in the front as well.
Yeah, be careful. I actually answer personal questions.
It seemed important in your personal rediscovery of your religion that prayer was beneficial for people, or that religion was beneficial. And one thing I was wondering is, I've seen you very much focused on the individual and on the neurological benefits for individuals, but for societally at large, I've seen a number of studies that correlate religiosity with negative social health factors like higher teen pregnancy rate, higher homicide rate, things like that. I was actually looking at one yesterday, and the correlation between how often people prayed and under 5 mortality was quite striking. So I was wondering initially what you made of that, and then when we were discussing it earlier, it was brought up that you distinguish between 2 types of prayer. So maybe one type might be not as beneficial or even harmful, whereas the other one could be beneficial. So then I thought, would you distinguish between religious prayer and secular meditation, and do you think one of them might be more likely to be the more beneficial type of prayer rather than the less?
Yeah, so part of the thing that drove me out of faith in the first place was not only how frightening I found God's morality in the Old Testament or confusing in the New Testament, but was how awful the church was. Church was awful in the States. I've seen people of different gender identities and sexual orientations take their own lives because they were so viciously persecuted by people of faith. Certainly no resonance here, but in the States we had a little problem where priests of church traditions were molesting children and being covered up not only by the church institution but by law enforcement to protect this whatever. And that's love? You got to be kidding me. That's disgusting. And the more studies I read, the more I found that religion, right along with what atheists argued, was a negative force in human society. And I always had this little thing holding me, though. I'd seen religion do good things in people's lives. I'd seen people give up hard drug addiction because they believed they encountered Jesus, and it stuck. I'd seen people have marriages that survived that otherwise weren't. And I couldn't figure out, like, what's the difference? Why is it, for example, studies show that Christians consistently give more money to charity, including to secular charities, than non-religious people? What's the difference? Why is it sometimes causing violence and oppression and destruction, and other times causing a positive social good? First, what is the dominant neurological model of God in the community? A God of love or a God of wrath? You'll find in a lot of religious institutions, all the energy is about God's wrath and judgment, and we're on the inside and they are on the outside. And when that happens, churches become prone to authoritarianism, where the commandments of power structures are more important than the animating ideals of the institution. And in a judgeful God, wrathful God, authoritarian structure, it makes all the sense in the world to hide child abuse to protect the institution, because the institution is more important than the people that compose it. And that is not of Christ. Because according to Jesus in the First Testament, who is the church? The people. And what is good for the people is good for the church. Which means there can be no excuse for hiding behind theology or dogma or tradition to hide abuses from the church. The most valuable thing in the world to me is the critique skeptics have against the abuses the church places on society. Because in doing so, I believe Richard Dawkins is this generation's Jeremiah. He is a prophet speaking out against evil done by people claiming God. So what I've seen in these studies, I haven't seen a study to back this up. I've talked to a couple researchers who are considering it. When you control for authoritarianism in religious structures, you find the good and the bad of religion. When religion's good, it invites you into contemplation and introspection and social action. When religion is bad, it says we're the good guys and they're the bad guys and we have to win. And I'm done with we have to win religion.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, but we will have another question and answer session after lunch.
Hey, Mike. It's good to meet you. So I'm somebody who lost my faith. Some of my best friends are in this room. My son's godparents are sitting next to me. One of I was effectively disowned by my parents for losing my faith. My mother said that it would have been better if I died before I lost my faith than to have lived long enough to lose it and therefore be destined for hell. I've been spiritually abused by by fundamentalist religion, but I'm here because I still consider many Christians to be some of my closest friends, and I love Rob and Greg who put this event on. I don't believe in God anymore. I still don't, but so I appreciate your ability to help me find and pursue and point me towards the benefits of a practice of mindfulness meditation and the benefits of that. There is a question at the end of this, and thanks for letting me kind of be slightly autobiographical here for a little bit. If I could talk about like my struggle with your work, and I really struggled with it while reading Finding God in the Waves all the way through, was that in my life the easiest, like the thing in the world would be to be able to come back to religion in the sense of like being able to call mindfulness meditation prayer, being able to call, like to have the Spinozan Einsteinian God of the cosmos and that mystery for me to call that God instead of the cosmos and meditate on that. I could potentially get my parents' love back by doing that. I could potentially plug back into a community of some sort where I didn't have to like put to death my kind of rationalism and my inability to take on board theological claims, my dissatisfaction with faith as an epistemological framework. So like I feel like some of the success that I've seen in your work is that like you are a success story for the church. It's like the prodigal son has come home.
Some Southern Baptists would strongly disagree, but yes.
I completely understand that. I've thought about like, well, do I become a Unitarian? But I have so much baggage from how I was abused by the church. Like, I don't even want to go to a Unitarian church where I can just be an atheist and like enjoy the community and the fellowship and the biscuits. But like your story, like if I could just call all that stuff God and like put all of the Christian wrapping on that candy bar, like then I could get something back. But I can't bring myself to do that. And I'm not saying that you're doing it in a manipulative way at all.
Totally get it.
So, like, is there any advice that you could give for somebody in my position who, like, loves Christians? I can't bring myself to go to church because I don't want my kids to hear about Noah's Ark or have some of these stories taught as historical fact. And so I stay away from church because of the dogma and the authoritarianism that you've described. And, like, what do I do?
Grieve. You grieve. You have been hurt. People have hurt you using religious imagery and language and now those things are associated with trauma and pain in your brain. Of course it would seem terrible for you to call the cosmos God, because you've been hurt in the name of God. The part of your brain wrestling with all the rhetoric and the logic and the analysis of who God is your neocortex. It's as thick as a tortilla wrapped around the outside of your brain, and it surrounds the roughly brick-sized and weight limbic system, emotional, intuitive parts of your brain. And those go, I don't really understand language, but I understand pain. And we treat our trauma like a logical puzzle, and then we wonder why we can't get through it. Because we're just stirring the surface. You've got to find healing from the trauma you experienced. And I don't care what you believe about God for the rest of your life. What I care is that you learn to know and love yourself and are whole, and that there are people in your life who love you and accept you as you are. If your parents require you to believe something in order to love you, that's not love, it's manipulation, and they are the ones who are wrong, not you. And I want to tell you, every person in this room is so glad you're here and so comfortable with what you believe, and you are accepted here. What's next? Thank you. What's next is the worst part. What's next is finding somebody you can trust, possibly a professional, with whom you can dip past cognition and into the emotions to unstick this trauma that is literally coded in relationships between neurons in your brain. You've experienced such rejection that it could trigger you at any moment. It could cause unexpected behaviors, and you deserve the opportunity and the space to heal. And what I would recommend is you take the whole God thing and you just set it aside. The whole church thing, you set it aside. And you deal with the trauma. In the meantime, you love your kids. You just love them. The fact that you care enough that they're not indoctrinated by religious power systems tells me you're a good father. And if you decide one day to take them to a non-judgmental faith community, fantastic. If you don't, they might go to a church on their own when they grow up. Our job as parents is not to photocopy our brains into these little humans. Our job is to prepare them to live in a world that we'll never see and can't explain. And the best way to do that is not repeating the mistake of attaching some belief to love. So just make sure your kids know whether they're atheists or fundamentalists, Dad loves them. And in doing so, you will break a train of trauma and create a better world. We're so
Thank
glad
you.
you're here.
Thanks, Mike, for that. Okay, thank you. Okay, that brings us to the end of our question and answer session for this morning. We are going to give you about a 5-10 minute opportunity to get up from your seats, stretch your legs, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and bring it back to your table. And we'll be back with our next speaker. Thank you.